April 8, 1943, 27,000 feet above Cologne, Germany. The black sky rippled with the dull red pulse of anti-aircraft fire. Below, the city of Cologne glowed faintly through the haze, a spiderweb of light and shadow, fractured by smoke columns rising from the last wave of bombs. The engines of Lancaster ED-702, call sign O-Orange, thundered through the darkness, for Rolls-Royce Merlin straining under the cold night air. Inside the bomber's narrow fuselage, Flight Lieutenant Arthur, Jack, Redding, 24 years old, from Leeds, wiped frost from his oxygen mask. The Lancaster shuddered violently as flak bursts cracked just off the port wing. "Hold her steady," he barked into the intercom, his voice half-drowned by static. The flight engineer, Sergeant Bill Conroy, eyes glued to the instrument panel, muttered under his breath, "Engines 2 and 4 are still good, for now." He tapped a pressure gauge that trembled near the red. In the rear turret, Gunner Ted Morris swept his twin .303 Brownings through the darkness. His view was a nightmare of tracers, flak, and searchlights that clawed the night sky like white-hot fingers. Somewhere below, a German Flak 88 battery tracked their altitude, its crew working frantically to predict the next burst. Then it came, a violent jolt as flak tore through the fuselage. The Lancaster lurched left, metal shrieking. Conroy shouted, "Hit near the bomb bay." Sparks danced through the cockpit as Redding fought the controls. Yet the bomber kept climbing, shaking, growling, refusing to fall. Down below, a German night fighter pilot, Lieutenant Karl Voss of Jagdgeschwader 1, NJG-1, banked his Bf-110 through the haze. His radar operator called out, "Contact." 4 kilometers ahead, 500 meters above. Voss craned his neck and saw it, a black silhouette against the faint cloud glow, massive and square-bodied, the unmistakable shape of a Lancaster. He sneered into his mask. "Da oben, die Fliegen schon." Up there, the flying barn. It was a name passed around the Luftwaffe's night fighter squadrons. The British bomber was enormous, broad wings, deep belly, flat sides, like a lumbering barn adrift in the sky. They joked it could be hit with a blindfold on. Yet every German pilot who mocked it also knew the truth: if you missed your first attack, that barn could kill you. Its gunners, radar decoys, and disciplined formation flying made every approach a gamble. Voss adjusted his throttle, lining up for an upward attack. Closing in. "Prepare Schrägmusik," he ordered, activating the twin 20mm cannons mounted diagonally in his cockpit roof, designed to fire upward into the vulnerable bellies of bombers. He slipped beneath the Lancaster's shadow. The massive plane loomed above him, a hulking black fortress blotting out the stars. The heat from its exhaust shimmered like liquid silver. Voss exhaled, steadied his crosshair, then pulled the trigger. 2 bursts of cannon fire ripped into the bomber's undercarriage. Sparks and fragments sprayed across the night. For a moment, it seemed to falter, but instead of breaking apart, the Lancaster roared back. The dorsal gunner spotted the Bf-110 and unleashed a burst of .303 rounds. Tracers stitched through the night, striking Voss's wing. His cockpit lit up with warning lights. "Verdammt," he cursed, jerking the stick. His fighter peeled off, trailing smoke. Back inside O-Orange, the crew exhaled in unison. "He's gone," Ted shouted, laughing with disbelief. Redding checked his instruments, one engine gone, another coughing, yet the altimeter still held steady. "Homeward, boys," he said quietly, his voice calm despite the chaos. "Let's bring her back." As the great bomber limped westward, the crew fell silent, each man listening to the rhythmic thump of the remaining engines. Below them, Cologne burned, another scar in the night's endless war. To the Germans watching from below, that giant British machine looked slow, clumsy, and crude, like a flying barn lumbering through the clouds. But for those who faced it in the air, the Lancaster was something else entirely. A predator in the dark. A monster that would not die. And before the war was over, its name would become both a joke and a warning. Manchester, England, January 1941. A cold wind swept across the Avro factory at Chatterton, carrying the clang of hammers and the whine of rivet guns through the air. Britain was still reeling from the Blitz, London smouldered, Coventry lay in ruins, and Bomber Command needed something bigger, stronger, and deadlier. Inside the hangar, engineer Roy Chadwick, head designer at Avro, stood beside a skeletal airframe under construction. "She'll fly higher and farther than anything we've built before," he told a group of RAF officers. His voice was steady, but his eyes betrayed exhaustion. Months of redesigns and sleepless nights had led to this, the prototype that would soon become the Avro Lancaster. The bomber taking shape before them was born from failure. Its predecessor, the Avro Manchester, had been plagued with unreliable engines, twin vultures that overheated and seized midair. Crews despised it. But Chadwick refused to let his design die. He proposed something radical: add 2 more engines. By fitting the airframe with 4 Rolls-Royce Merlin engines, the same powerplants that roared in the Spitfire, Chadwick transformed the Manchester into something entirely new. The aircraft grew longer, its wingspan stretched, and its bomb bay deepened to carry the heaviest ordnance ever conceived. When the prototype, BT-308, took flight in January 1941, the test pilot, Captain H.A. Sam Brown, could hardly contain himself. "She handles beautifully," he reported. "Like a fighter, only 4 times the size." The Air Ministry was impressed. Orders came swiftly, and production began in secret facilities scattered across Britain, Manchester, Chester, Yedden, and even Canadian plants later on. The RAF had found its warhorse. But for all its strength and elegance, German pilots saw something different when they first encountered it. The Lancaster's silhouette was unmistakable: tall tail fins, slab-sided fuselage, and a vast wingspan that caught the moonlight like a silver barn roof. When it first appeared over Bremen and Kiel, German radar operators mocked it. "Ein Fliegen schon," they laughed, "a flying barn." The nickname spread quickly across Luftwaffe squadrons. But the laughter didn't last long. May 1942, Operation Millennium. The sky over Cologne burned red as over 1,000 British bombers, the largest raid in history, swept across the Rhine. Among them, the new Lancasters made their debut, carrying unprecedented payloads deep into Germany. The air shook with the combined roar of nearly 4,000 Merlin engines. German night fighter crews scrambled in confusion. Their radar screens lit up with hundreds of blips. Controllers shouted orders over the radio, but the swarm was too vast to contain. The flying barns filled the heavens, their bomb bays spilling devastation on an industrial scale. From below, the spectacle was surreal: massive silhouettes gliding through bursts of flak, searchlights catching the glossy undersides of their wings, revealing bomb bays gaping open like iron jaws. One German gunner described it in disbelief. "They came in slow, steady, unafraid. You could hit one, watch it burn, and it still wouldn't fall. It just kept going." What the Luftwaffe had mocked as a lumbering barn turned out to be one of the toughest, most efficient bombing platforms of the war. Its wide frame, once a target of ridicule, gave it an advantage, allowing it to carry heavier payloads, fuel reserves, and defensive guns in every direction. By 1943, the Lancaster had become the backbone of RAF Bomber Command. Crews adored it. German pilots cursed it. And deep within the skies over Europe, a brutal game of endurance began, one where the flying barn proved that its bulk wasn't a weakness. It was armor. RAF Scampton, Lincolnshire, June 1943. The sun was barely up when Flight Lieutenant Jack Redding and his crew trudged across the dew-soaked tarmac toward their Lancaster, codenamed Orange. The bomber loomed ahead like a sleeping giant, its black belly gleaming faintly under the dawn light. Ground crews scurried around it, fueling, loading, checking controls, as the air filled with the heavy scent of oil and cordite. From a distance, it looked clumsy, boxy, almost awkward, but up close, it commanded awe. Each rivet, each curve, spoke of purpose. To those who flew it, the Lancaster wasn't just a machine. It was a lifeboat in the storm. "Climb aboard, lads," Redding called. The 7-man crew moved with practiced rhythm. The pilot and flight engineer squeezed into the cramped cockpit, barely wide enough for two. Behind them sat the navigator, surrounded by charts and glowing instruments, and the wireless operator, headphones already crackling with static. In the fuselage's cold, narrow corridor, the bomb aimer settled into his forward position, his face pressed to the perspex dome. And at the tail, isolated and alone, the rear gunner, Ted Morris, climbed into his tiny turret, locking himself inside his glass cage. "Feels like crawling inside a bloody tin can," Ted muttered. He wasn't wrong. Temperatures could drop to -40°C at altitude. Oxygen was thin, frost formed on the inside of masks, and even with layers of sheepskin, the cold bit through to the bone. Once airborne, the Lancaster was a world unto itself, a floating steel corridor echoing with engine thunder. The intercom crackled constantly. "Course 042 degrees. Bomb doors opening. Steady, steady, bombs gone." Each mission stretched into hours of silent endurance. Crews could see the flash of flak below, black puffs rising like dirty blossoms in the moonlight, or catch brief glimpses of another Lancaster in formation, its belly glowing red as it released its payload. And yet, amid all the fear and exhaustion, there was admiration, almost affection. "She's a flying barn," Bill Conroy would joke, patting the side of the fuselage during pre-flight checks. "But she's our barn." The Lancaster's spacious bomb bay could carry up to 14,000 pounds of explosives, double what the American B-17 could manage. Its payload flexibility was unmatched, from incendiary clusters to 8,000-pound blockbusters designed to level entire city blocks. Still, the bomber wasn't invincible. The crew knew that every takeoff carried a 50% chance they wouldn't return. Searchlights hunted them, flak tore through their wings, night fighters stalked them like wolves. But the Lancaster had something rare: resilience. It could lose an engine, sometimes two, and still make it home. Pilots told stories of limping back across the channel with fuel lines severed, wings shredded, and tail sections barely holding on. Back in Germany, night fighter crews learned to recognize the sound of those Merlins long before they saw the plane. "You could hear them," one Luftwaffe pilot recalled. "For engines, perfectly tuned, not hurried, not afraid. Just, coming." And with them came the thunder of destruction. In Berlin, Hamburg, and Essen, civilians whispered of the English Wehrmotorage, the English four-engine bomber, that returned again and again, no matter how many were shot down. To the Germans below, it was both a terror and a mystery. To the men inside, it was a fragile home among the stars. As the summer of 1943 deepened, the flying barn became a symbol of British resolve, vast, unrelenting, and impossible to ignore. But its greatest test was yet to come, a mission so daring it would define the Lancaster's legend forever. RAF Scampton, Lincolnshire, night of May 16, 1943. The hangars were dark, the air thick with tension. Ground crews whispered around the hulking silhouettes of 19 specially modified Lancasters, each carrying a weapon unlike any seen before, a strange, cylindrical bomb slung beneath the fuselage, its surface engraved with delicate fins. This was Operation Chastise, a mission so secret that even most of the airbase didn't know its purpose. Its target, the massive Möhne, Eder, and Sorp dams deep inside Germany's Ruhr Valley, the industrial heart of the Third Reich. Inside one of those aircraft, Wing Commander Guy Gibson, aged only 24, checked his watch. "Gentlemen," he said, his voice calm but heavy. "We're going in low. Remember your altitudes, keep formation tight. Let's make history." At precisely 21:28, the first Lancaster rolled down the runway, its engines screaming into the night. One by one, the flying barns took off into darkness, but tonight, they weren't lumbering giants. They were precision instruments. Flying at 60 feet above the water, the crews skimmed rivers and treetops, dodging power lines and gunfire. The moon cast silver reflections on the surface, revealing their silhouettes to startled German sentries below. The Lancaster's wings, so often mocked for their size, now became their saving grace, providing the lift and control needed to hold those perilous altitudes. Gibson's voice crackled through the intercom. "Steady. Hold her level. Prepare to drop." Bomb aimer FLT Lieutenant John Hopgood peered through his sights, aligning two converging searchlights on the dam wall, the cue to release. Now. The bouncing bomb, designed by engineer Barnes Wallace, spun backward at 500 revolutions per minute and skipped across the water like a skipping stone, striking the dam's face before sinking and detonating. The explosion tore through the night. A wall of water erupted, rising higher than the bomber itself. Moments later, the Moon Dam began to crumble. From Gibson's cockpit, the crew watched in awe as floodwaters surged through the valley. "We got it," Gibson said quietly. "We bloody got it." News of the dam-busters' raid electrified Britain. The Lancaster had done the impossible, flying low enough to drop bombs with pinpoint precision, executing one of the most daring missions of the war. In Germany, disbelief turned to dread. Luftwaffe reports described the attackers in astonishment. Large four-engine bombers, flying impossibly low, fearless of flak or searchlights, unstoppable. Even as propaganda tried to downplay the damage, German engineers privately admitted that the raids had crippled hydroelectric power for weeks. More importantly, they shattered the illusion of safety deep inside the Reich. The nickname, Flying Barn, took on a new meaning after that night. No longer just a target for ridicule, it became a symbol of ingenuity and terror. German night fighter ace Heinz Wolfgang Schnaufer, who had once joked that Lancasters were easy to find, impossible to miss, now briefed his squadron with a colder tone. "They are not clumsy. They are deliberate. Treat every Lancaster as a weapon in itself." As the summer of 1943 bled into autumn, Lancaster squadrons expanded their reach. Berlin, Leipzig, Nuremberg, Kiel, each name etched into the bomber's growing legacy. But as the bombing intensified, so too did the danger. The Luftwaffe adapted, introducing radar-guided flak and deadly new night fighters armed with upward-firing cannons. For the men inside the Flying Barn, every mission felt like threading a needle through death itself. Still, they flew. Because by now, the Lancaster wasn't just another aircraft. It was the spear point of Britain's war in the air, the machine that made mockery into myth. Berlin, Germany, night of November 22, 1943. The city slept beneath a pale winter moon, its streets darkened by blackout curtains. Somewhere in the distance, the faint wail of an air raid siren began to rise, slow, uncertain, like a warning from a dream. Then came the droning. Low at first, then swelling into a deep, rhythmic thunder that rolled across the city like an approaching storm. Above the clouds, Lancasters of No. 83 Squadron roared eastward in tight formation. The sky ahead glowed faintly red from the fires of earlier raids. At 18,000 feet, Flight Lieutenant Jack Redding and his crew had been in the air for over 3 hours. Their faces were pale in the dim light of the cockpit instruments. "Target coming up," Navigator Tom Harding said, tracing his pencil over a map cluttered with flak zones. Redding nodded. "All right, boys. This is it. Keep sharp." Berlin, the very heart of Hitler's empire, was about to feel the full weight of the Flying Barn. From the ground, the first searchlight speared the sky. Dozens followed, weaving a lattice of white beams that clawed upward through the smoke. Flak batteries opened fire, their bursts blooming black and orange like thunderheads. "Christ, they're awake tonight," Conroy muttered from the engineer's seat, his eyes darting across the dials. Redding's hands were steady on the controls, guiding the bomber into its run. "Steady, keep it straight. Below, the city came into view, a sprawl of fire and shadow. Whole districts glowed red, others lay in darkness. The bomb aimer, Sergeant Peter Vaughan, leaned forward in his glass blister, his gloved hand gripping the release toggle. Left, left, hold, steady. Bomb doors open. On target. Bombs away. The Lancaster jolted upward as its payload fell free, a mix of 4,000-pound cookies and incendiary clusters. Seconds later, the earth below erupted in flame. Vaughan pressed his face to the sight, whispering, "Good hit, right in the center." But celebration was brief. Fighter. Port side. Ted Morris screamed from the rear turret. A Ju-88 night fighter dove through the flak, its cannons flashing blue. Tracers stitched the air around them. Redding threw the bomber into a dive, metal screaming under the strain. "Hang on." Morris opened fire, twin Browning spitting fire into the darkness. He saw the German fighter flash past his guns, hit, and spiral away in flames. "Got him." The crew cheered, but only for a heartbeat. Flak tore through the fuselage, punching holes through the bomb bay doors. Conroy shouted, "We're losing pressure." Redding steadied the plane. The altimeter was dropping, but the engine still growled defiantly. "She's holding, lads," he said through gritted teeth. "She's bloody holding." By dawn, the survivors limped home, engine sputtering, fuel nearly gone. As Orange touched down at Scampton, its landing gear groaned and one tire burst, but she made it. Ground crews rushed to the bomber, staring at the damage, a dozen holes through the wings, shredded control cables, and flak embedded in the fuselage. Yet she had flown over 1,000 miles and returned. One mechanic ran his hand over the battered hull. "Looks like a barn after a storm," he said softly. Redding smiled weakly. "A flying barn, mate, and the toughest one in Europe." That winter, Berlin endured 16 major raids by Lancasters. The Germans could no longer deny what they faced, a machine that defied every insult, every attempt to bring it down. The Luftwaffe doubled its defenses. New radar systems, faster night fighters, and heavier flak blanketed the skies. Yet the Lancasters came, night after night, in greater numbers, in tighter formations. For German civilians, the drone of 4 Merlins became the sound of dread. For fighter pilots like Karl Voss, the same who once called it, the flying barn, the sound meant one thing, an unstoppable enemy, advancing through the darkness, cloaked in smoke and courage. And still, even as the odds worsened, the Lancaster crews kept flying. Because every mission brought them one step closer to ending the war. But as 1944 dawned, the flying barn would face its most dangerous challenge yet, a mission so destructive, even its creators questioned if the price was worth it. Hamburg, Germany, night of July 27, 1943. The sky was already glowing before the bombers arrived. Fires from the previous night's raid still burned across the city, their orange reflections rippling on the river Elbe. But this night, the third wave of Operation Gemara, would be worse. Much worse. At 20,000 feet, over 100 Lancasters from No. 5 Group thundered toward the target, their formation tight, their engines synchronized in a single, deafening heartbeat. Inside Orange, Flight Lieutenant Jack Redding adjusted his oxygen mask and glanced down at the inferno below. "Looks like hell's already open," he muttered. "Hell's just getting started," came the reply from the bomb aimer, Peter Vaughan. The crew had seen fire before. Cologne, Essen, Berlin, all cities they'd watched burn through the glass of the bomb site. But Hamburg was different. A hot, dry summer and weeks without rain had turned the city into a tinderbox. The RAF knew it. And tonight, they carried a new weapon, a deadly combination of high-explosive bombs to shatter roofs, followed by thousands of incendiaries to ignite the wreckage. "Target markers ahead," Navigator Tom Harding called out. Below, red flares glowed faintly through the haze, the Pathfinder's signal. "Steady, bomb doors open," Reading ordered. From the nose, Vaughan took a deep breath. "Steady, steady, bombs away." The Lancaster lurched upward as its 14,000-pound load tumbled out. Seconds later, the city below erupted. Explosions rippled through the streets, each one feeding the fires already raging. Within minutes, the flames merged into a single, monstrous wall, a firestorm, a phenomenon so intense that it created its own wind, sucking oxygen from the ground and hurling burning debris through the air like rain. German firefighter Otto Hanser later described it. The air itself caught fire. The heat pulled people off the ground. The sky roared like a furnace. From above, Reading's crew watched in stunned silence. The glow of Hamburg was so bright that even at altitude, they could read their instruments without lamps. "Dear God," Vaughan whispered. "We did that." For a long moment, no one spoke. Even hardened airmen felt a chill that had nothing to do with altitude. Below, chaos reigned. Whole neighborhoods disintegrated. Streets melted. In bomb shelters, oxygen vanished as the firestorm consumed everything. Over 40,000 civilians died in a single night, one of the most devastating bombing raids in human history. In Berlin, Joseph Goebbels wrote in his diary, "Hamburg is gone, a city of death." The English bombers have achieved what no army could. When the Lancasters returned to base, blackened by soot and smoke, the crews were met not with cheers, but with silence. Ground crews stared at the aircraft, their fuselages streaked with ash, their faces ghostly pale. Reading climbed down from the cockpit and looked toward the eastern horizon, where the sky still glowed faintly red. "Flying barns," he murmured. "That's what they call us." He paused, then added quietly, "Guess the barns burn back." From that night onward, the Germans' nickname, Die Fliegende Schon, took on a new, darker meaning. It was no longer a joke. It was a grim acknowledgement of the destruction the Lancaster could bring. Even Luftwaffe veterans who once mocked its ungainly size now spoke of it with awe. Major Martin Drews, a night fighter ace, put it simply. It was big, yes, but it carried the power of 1,000 fires. Yet the men who flew it rarely saw themselves as executioners. To them, the Lancaster was a duty, not vengeance, a necessary burden to end a brutal war. But in the months ahead, that burden would grow heavier still. For beyond Hamburg lay new targets, hardened bunkers, submarine pens, even secret weapon sites buried deep in the earth. And for those missions, the Flying Barn would be armed with something new, something monstrous. Woodhall Spa, Lincolnshire, September 1944. The hangar was silent except for the echo of boots on concrete. A dozen RAF engineers stood in awe before a weapon so enormous it seemed impossible for flight, the 12,000-pound Tallboy bomb, designed by the same man who had created the Dambuster's bouncing bomb, Barnes Wallis. At nearly 21 feet long, sleek and perfectly balanced, the Tallboy wasn't meant to explode on the surface, it was designed to penetrate deep into the earth before detonating, creating an underground shockwave that shattered bunkers, bridges, and even entire mountainsides. And there was only one aircraft in the Allied arsenal capable of carrying it, the Avro Lancaster. In the autumn of 1944, as the Allies pushed into France and the Low Countries, Lancaster squadrons were re-equipped for a new purpose, precision strikes on hardened German targets. No more area bombing. Now, it was about surgical destruction. Flight Lieutenant Jack Reading and his veteran crew of Orange had survived more than 70 missions. Their bomber was scarred but unbroken, patched together so many times it looked like a quilt of metal plates. On the morning of September 15, they stood beside it, staring at the Tallboy being winched into the bomb bay. Conroy whistled. "Looks like we're dropping a submarine." "Feels like it, too," Reading replied. "Let's hope the wings stay on." Their target that day was the Saumur railway tunnel in occupied France, a vital supply route for German reinforcements. As they climbed to 20,000 feet, the Lancaster labored under the bomb's immense weight. Every vibration felt amplified, every creak seemed louder. "Feels different today," Navigator Tom Harding said quietly. Redding nodded. "That's because we're carrying an earthquake." They arrived over the Loire Valley just before dawn. The bomb aimer, Vaughan, took his position, his breath fogging the glass. Below, the dark line of the railway tunnel cut through the hillside. "Steady, left, hold her there, bombs away." The Tallboy fell cleanly, tumbling through cloud and smoke. It struck near the tunnel entrance and vanished underground. A heartbeat later, the earth convulsed. The hillside rose like a wave, and then collapsed. The tunnel was obliterated. Back at base, reconnaissance photos confirmed it, the entire line had been buried beneath tons of rock. The Germans couldn't repair it. Over the next months, Tallboys found their way to more infamous targets, the V-1 and V-2 rocket sites at Mimoyex, the U-boat pens at Brest, and finally the Tirpitz, the pride of the Kriegsmarine. November 12, 1944, Tromsø Fjord, Norway. 32 Lancasters from numbers 9 and 617 squadrons roared over the Arctic waters. Their objective, sink the mighty German battleship Tirpitz, hidden among the fjords and defended by smoke screens and flak. At 12,000 feet, Wing Commander James Tate gave the order. Tallboys fell like silent meteors. One bomb pierced the deck near the forward turret and detonated deep within the hull. The explosion tore through the ship, capsizing her in minutes. Over 1,000 German sailors went down with her. It was the ultimate demonstration of what the flying barn could do, not just burn cities, but break the back of the Reich's war machine. But even that wasn't the Lancaster's final evolution. In early 1945, Wallace unveiled something even greater, the 22,000-pound Grand Slam, nicknamed the earthquake bomb. To carry it, Lancasters had to be stripped bare, turrets removed, bomb bay doors modified, and fuselages reinforced. The Grand Slam could crack concrete from 30 feet underground and level a viaduct with a single hit. On March 14, 1945, one of these giants was dropped on the Bielefeld Viaduct. The bomb smashed through the air at 750 miles per hour, burrowed into the earth beneath the bridge, and detonated with such force that shockwaves rippled through the countryside. The bridge simply disappeared. A German engineer later wrote in disbelief. "We heard it before we saw it, a shriek, a flash, and then the ground moved like an ocean. No human-made structure could survive it." By the spring of 1945, the Lancaster was no longer just a bomber. It was a weapon of strategic precision, capable of rewriting the laws of destruction. To the Germans who once laughed at its shape, it was now an omen, the harbinger of collapse. And to the men who flew it, each mission was a gamble with death, but also a statement of endurance, courage, and faith in a machine that had carried them through hell and back. Still, as the war neared its end, the question remained, what had the cost truly been, and what did victory mean for those who survived the flying barn? Over the Ruhr Valley, March 31, 1945. The war was almost over. The German front was collapsing, Allied tanks were pushing across the Rhine, and yet, still, the Lancasters flew. At 22,000 feet, the night sky glowed faintly orange from fires that had burned for months. Below, the once mighty industrial heart of Germany lay in ruins, twisted steel, cratered roads, rivers choked with debris. For Flight Lieutenant Jack Redding and the crew of Orange, this was mission number 78, their last. "Feels strange," murmured Tom Harding, the navigator. "All this time, and we're still up here." Redding's gloved hands rested on the control yoke, eyes fixed on the horizon. "One more run, Tom. One more." They were heading toward Kiel, to destroy the last surviving U-boat pens. The same targets the Lancasters had battered for 2 years, the same pens that had resisted everything until the Tallboy arrived. As the bomb doors opened and the engines howled, the men inside the flying barn fell into the familiar rhythm. Commands, confirmations, breathing through oxygen masks, all second nature. And when the bombs fell, they didn't cheer anymore. They just watched the explosions silently, like men paying respect to something far older and darker than war. Down below, the Germans hardly fought back. Flak batteries sputtered weakly. Searchlights flickered on and off, a dying reflex from a city that knew the end had come. In the streets, civilians didn't run to shelters. They simply stood and watched the black shadows pass overhead, the bombers that once symbolized fear, now symbols of inevitability. One German officer later wrote, "When we heard them, we didn't curse. We just knew it was over." When Reading's Lancaster touched down at Scampton just after dawn, the airfield was wet with mist. Ground crews waited as the engines wound down, for Merlins coughing their last. Ted Morris climbed from his rear turret, eyes red from exhaustion. "That's it," he said softly. "We made it." Reading looked back at Orange, battered, patched, but still standing. The aircraft had survived flak, fighters, fire, and freezing nights. It had carried them through everything. For a long moment, the 7 men stood in silence beside their machine. Then Reading placed a hand on the cold metal skin. "Good girl," he whispered. "You got us home." A few weeks later, on May 8, 1945, Victory in Europe Day, the Lancasters that had once darkened German skies flew a final, peaceful formation over London. Crowds filled the streets, waving and cheering as the bombers passed overhead in salute. Among them was Orange, patched and proud, flying slower than the rest, her engines still faithful. Down below, few understood what those crews had endured, the fear, the losses, the nights spent in silence above burning cities. Of the 125,000 aircrew who served in Bomber Command, nearly 55,000 never came home. One of the highest casualty rates of the entire war. Every mission carried death, for those below and those within. In post-war Germany, the nickname, Flying Barn, lingered in memory, not as a mockery, but as a strange, grim mark of respect. To Luftwaffe veterans, it symbolized an opponent that refused to break, a machine that embodied Allied persistence. Lieutenant Karl Voss, who had first uttered the name in 1943, survived the war. Years later, when interviewed, he said quietly, "Yes, we called it the Flying Barn. It looked big, slow, easy to kill. But when I saw one survive 3 attacks, burning, engines gone, and still flying west, I stopped laughing. It was not a barn. It was a fortress with wings." The Avro Lancaster had dropped over 600,000 tons of bombs, fought in every major air offensive from 1942 to 1945, and redefined strategic bombing. Yet beyond the numbers, it became something more, a symbol of endurance, of fear, of the thin line between heroism and horror. When peace finally came, most Lancasters were scrapped. Their metal repurposed, their names forgotten. But a few survived, preserved in museums or flown at memorials, their engines still growling like distant thunder. Visitors often stand beneath them, looking up at their vast wings and cavernous bays, wondering how such a thing ever flew. And somewhere in the back of every veteran's mind, echoes the sound of those 4 Merlins, steady, unbroken, eternal. The sound of the Flying Barn. The sound of a war that refused to be forgotten.